Thank you for tuning in to Latin America Today. I'm Corie Welch, and I'll be your host for this episode. As always, I want to remind you that this podcast is free and ad-free, but the Washington office on Latin America operates entirely on gifts and donations. So please support our work. The easiest way to do so is by visiting WOLA.org and clicking Donate right at the top. Ruth Eleonora López Alfaro is a Salvadoran human rights lawyer and anti-corruption defender who worked for Cristosal and was arrested on May 18, 2025, when National Civil Police agents broke into her home without a warrant at 11 o'clock at night. She has been held at the maximum security Izalco prison ever since. Amnesty International has declared her a prisoner of conscience, and she has been recognized with some of the most prestigious international human rights awards, all from behind bars. Today's episode is one that is important for us here at WOLA. Ruth López and Cristosal have been trusted partners of ours. She's someone we've worked with closely, relied on, and deeply respected. A few months before her arrest, she sat down with me for our Women's Month episode. So when we heard she had been arrested in the middle of the night, it was not an abstract news story. But Ruth's story reflects a deep and troubling reality in El Salvador, where nearly 100,000 people have been incarcerated in the context of the state of exception since 2022. Her work denouncing corruption made her a target of Bukele's government, which showed its willingness to weaponize its judicial system to silence its critics. As has happened in other authoritarian contexts such as Venezuela and Nicaragua, her case gives way to a troubling phenomenon in El Salvador: political imprisonment. Today, I'm joined by two guests who know this case and this moment in El Salvador intimately. Luis Benavides is Ruth's husband, and Noah Bullock is the director of Cristosal. Luis, Noah, thank you both for being here.
That's great to be here. Thanks for having us too.
To start, Noah, Cristosal was forced out of El Salvador and is now operating from exile in Guatemala. Can you help listeners understand what Ruth and Cristosal represented and why that made them a target?
Yeah, I think in El Salvador, the government spends a lot of money producing videos and content to create a narrative of, a unique leader in the president, one who's they allude to that he might be sent by God, and to create this idea of like a rebirth in the country. But behind that facade, behind that shiny propaganda apparatus is a truth of victims, of people who have suffered abuses of power, human rights violations. And that's what Cristosal has helped make visible. Our investigations have documented the truth of the people who have been victims of the concentration of power that's happened under the Bukele regime. And that truth reveals a different image than the one that they want to project on their shiny social media platforms. It's one of an autocrat who's similar to other autocrats around the world. It steals public funds, creates benefits for him and his family and his friends, uses violence, torture, arbitrary detention, forced disappearances to impose an environment of fear, and persecutes his political opposition. And that's what Ruth has in some ways become the face of that.
Luis, can you take us back to the night of May 18th last year? What happened when agents arrived at your home? And can you kind of break down that night for us a bit? Ruth was held incommunicado for 32 hours, was moved between 3 facilities, and the state never filed charges within the constitutional 72-hour window. How did you even know where she was at that time?
Okay, well, that night, the police came and knocked and told us they were looking for the owner of the vehicle parked outside, right? Was Ruth's vehicle. It was because of that vehicle, supposedly that had been involved in a traffic accident. So we went downstairs to meet the officers, still in our pajamas, of course, because it was almost midnight at that time on Sunday, the 18th. And we explained them that we hadn't been in an accident and we haven't even gone out that day. So, just when I thought that the situation was resolved and everything was going to be cleared up, one of the police officers pulled out a note, and he was clearly very ashamed. And he said to us that they were only following orders, that he had the order to arrest Ruth for the crime of embezzlement. The page where he read the order had only one paragraph. So, and he read the paragraph, and I was shocked, right? But Ruth at that time, she was very strong, she, with her characteristic strength, didn't stay silent. She questioned the order. She asked if anyone from the prosecutor's office was present and remind them that she was the one who was investigating corruption. That's why she were doing what she were doing, right? And that was the time when she told them to have decency, that all these would end in some day, right? So during this moment, Ruth's daughter was able to hear and see everything from the second floor, from a window at the second floor of our house. And when they took Ruth to detention, I was like, I wasn't shocked, but the first thing I did was to tell her sister and mother, or that, right? So that when I told them, they burst into tears because of the injustice. We know that Ruth is innocent, and that what they were trying to do, or what they actually have done, is to silence her, to prevent her from continuing her work of denouncing corruption and the authoritarian tendencies of this government. So after that night, early in the morning, I had a call from the police officers who told me that Ruth was in a facility called the Penalito, and that we needed to bring her breakfast and white clothes. Right? Mm-hmm. So we went to the Penalito and we asked for her, but they didn't tell us whether she was there or not. They only took the things that we brought to her, and we were waiting for her. We wait for her like an hour, and then suddenly I had another call. They told me, we are going to move her to another facility. Please go to the medicals, to the doctors, where she's having the prescriptions to have her medicines, and bring her. It's not breakfast; it's lunch, to another facility. And then later that day, another call, and bring her dinner and in another facility. And I was like, they were playing with us. They were playing with us, and we only were able to see her until Tuesday night, where they finally brought her to a facility of the PNC, National Police, in near the University of El Salvador. And it was a moment of uncertainty. What could have happened to her? We were really, really afraid of whether she was being tortured or anything else.
And so in this whole time, when you were being told to go to different facilities, did you know if she was actually in those facilities?
No, we didn't know. We didn't know. We even had the support of Cristosal lawyers, because Ruth did. So we had the support of Cristosal lawyers, because Ruth signed legal powers to represent her. And even them didn't have any answer of whether she was in one facility or in another one. So it was, we were really afraid that her life was at risk.
Wow, I can't even imagine. And this is an experience that many families in El Salvador face every day, correct?
That's right. Everybody who has a family member in jail, anybody knows whether they are alive, whether they are in good health. The only way to have some sort of idea of their being alive is when you go to the facility to bring what it's called the package, where you can bring her some food and some hygienic supplements, and they normally received it. The guards of this facilities receive the package to bring them to our family members. And when they continue to receive these packages, you have like some sort of idea of maybe they are there, but there's no, for sure, a certainty that they could be in one or another facility.
And for our US listeners who are maybe a bit less familiar with the Salvadoran prison systems, can you explain what the package is, kind of how that system operates and how much that costs for the average Salvadoran family?
Well, the package, it can cost like around $100,
Wow.
for instance. And I mean, if you have a complete package, it can cost like around $100, and you can bring them cookies, milk, but all in powder milk, sugar, cereals, and hygienic supplements, like toothbrush, right?
Mm-hmm.
Soap, a detergent, and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So what can you tell us about the state of exception in El Salvador? We understand that it's been framed as kind of this quote unquote necessary war on gangs, but this has resulted in the mass incarceration of, and you'll have to give me an updated number, of nearly 90,000 people since 2022. How does Ruth's case fit into that? And what does it reveal about how that emergency power is actually being used in the country?
So El Salvador has been under a state of emergency for 4 years now. And that was originally declared in response to a weekend in which the gangs massacred almost 90 people. And that had become a pattern. As we now know, the president and his party had formed a partnership with the gangs to create the perceptions of reduced homicides in exchange for benefits for gang members in prisons and political support for the president and his party. That's we now know as a result of investigations by federal prosecutors in New York. But the gangs would communicate periodically using violence, and that was how they were negotiating or dialoguing with the president. And so after that bloody weekend, the president ordered the Legislative Assembly to declare a state of emergency. And then, police and soldiers proceeded to round up, tens of thousands of people. The number that we know is the number that the Legislative Assembly publishes in their monthly renewals of the emergencies. And in 4 years, 90,000 people have been detained without evidence, without previous investigations, usually, police officers fulfilling quotas, anonymous tips. And they've been held now for 4 years, as Luis described, without access to families and defense attorneys. Our organization, Cristosal, we documented systematic patterns of torture. Torture has effectively become a state policy in the prisons. Even the Venezuelans who were sent by the Trump administration to the SECOT were tortured and abused sexually. And we've also documented over 420 killings. People have died as a consequence of torture. And we think that number, really the real number, is much higher. So the sort of promise or the deal that was offered to the Salvadoran people was a restriction on fundamental rights in exchange for security from the gangs. And the idea was that would be temporary as a means to establish control. But what we've seen over 4 years is that those exceptions to due process rights, to political and civil rights, have become permanent. Even a lot of them have been made permanent in law. So, for example, in Ruth's case, she was held for 15 days without being presented to a judge. That's the period of time under the state of exception that you can be held without being accused of a crime. Ruth, her trial was declared secret, even though she asked for a public trial. It's almost automatic now. People are being tried in secret. Ruth has been held with limited access to her family, and that's almost automatic now in El Salvador. Ruth has been held in prison for a year without trial. The pretrial detention is almost automatic. And in the case of people detained in the state of exception, different reforms that they've made to the penal code allow for them to be held up to 7 years without trial. And so I think what happened under the state of exception is, in some ways, the security environment in the country has been altered. The violence of gangs has been now substituted by the violence of an autocratic regime. They can detain whoever it wants, hold them indefinitely, and there are no institutions in the country that can intervene to protect the rights of those people. And what we have, there are thousands of innocent people being held in prison without any real ability to exercise a defense, or in the case of the families, even know if they're still alive. That's what Luis was saying.
And so the case of Ruth is definitely, as we understand it, a case of retaliation. Can you speak a little bit to the general environment in El Salvador, what it's like for human rights defenders and other organizations that are trying to investigate corruption or denounce the human rights violations that are happening?
Well, I think Ruth's case was emblematic. She was arrested to punish her for denouncing corruption and for her defense of democracy in the country. But her arrest was used to send a message to all of the society. The dissent, the people who think differently, it wouldn't be tolerated. And people believe that it's true because the government rounded up 90,000 people and held them indefinitely, right? An underlying factor here that 2% of the population has been detained. 1 in 50 Salvadorans is in prison without trial, without defense. And so nobody doubts that the government can do whatever they want to whoever they. And when they arrested Ruth, I think I remember talking with Ruth before her detention. We kind of thought that her visibility, her credibility, the support of Cristosal itself and our connections, kept her safe. And she felt like she could be a voice of people who didn't feel safe to use their own voices. And so when they arrested her, that assumption sort of fell through the ice and had a silencing effect. When Ruth was arrested, and then, days later when Enrique Anaya was arrested for defending Ruth and denouncing the injustices of her detention, a lot of us felt like we didn't know if that was just going to become a mass roundup of people. And that detonated an exodus of civil society leaders and journalists. And just to kind of close the idea here, the polls are pretty consistent in El Salvador that people say they give the president a high job approval rating, but majorities of people also say that they're afraid to criticize the president, including in recent polls, people say that criticizing the president on social media could be punished by prison. So there's an environment of fear in which I think people consciously or unconsciously have all altered their ways of living in El Salvador. Whether what you talk about at the kitchen table or at work, or what you like and post on social media, people all sort of process that could, whatever they say could have a consequence.
So Ruth has been declared a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International and is widely considered a political prisoner. Can you speak to any other political prisoners in El Salvador? And what does that mean for the health of democracy, expanding on what you were just talking about?
Yeah, well, just a 10-day period in which Ruth was arrested, they had arrested 2 other political prisoners, and Alejandro Enriquez and Jose Angel. They ended up accepting a plea bargain in order to get out of prison. They just felt like they were unable to exercise defense. And then, Fidel Zavala, who's a person who was a witness to torture and denounced it, he's in prison. He continues to be in prison. Enrique Anaya is in prison. We just produced a report to study political persecution in El Salvador. It's called The Price of Dissent. And we documented, 250 cases of political persecution. And of those, 186 cases of people who have been put in prison for political motives. 86 of them, we believe, are still in prison. But I think that underrepresents the true number. Among the people detained in the state of exception, it's hard to determine whether someone was detained for who they are and the way they exercise their right to speech, or were they just part of mass roundups. But the perception is that if you speak, you could suffer that reprisal.
Wow. And what should U.S. policymakers and the international community be doing right now on Ruth's case specifically, but on El Salvador more broadly?
Well, we hope that they join us and join Luis and Ruth's family in asking for the minimum, demanding that the Salvadoran government respect her rights to a fair and public trial, that she has access to her defense, that she shouldn't be held indefinitely in pretrial detention, while they're investigating her. There's a phrase in El Salvador, they say they arrest first and investigate later. But they have no idea. There's no case against Ruth. And so those are just minimum things that anyone should hope for themselves. And whether you agree with Ruth or not, I think that there's an interest collectively in defending her right to due process and a free and fair trial and to be treated fairly.
That's what she wants. I mean, she's screaming, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to have a fair trial. I want to have a public trial. And that's what I mean. Maybe the first idea that people from international community could be helping us to say, to impulse. And then I think to understand that we are living through a situation of repression of a lot of our liberties, a lot of our freedoms, for instance, freedom of expression. And we are living in a fear of exercising them because of this way of using the state of emergency, right? So that's just like Noah said. I mean, all people here are afraid of exercising their rights, of expressing themselves, mostly when you are going to express a criticism to the government, right? So we need everybody to understand what's going on here and why most of the time you won't be able to hear from any of us in El Salvador that these kind of things because of fear.
And so I think kind of piggybacking off of that, what do you think people in the United States need to know to understand about what's going on with Ruth's case, but also with the situation in El Salvador? What is something you would say kind of to WOLA's audience, who most of the people that listen to the podcast are here in the United States?
Well, I would say, when I met Ruth, it was before she joined Cristosal, but it was at the beginning of what we called the process of dictatorship in El Salvador, when the president and his family were sort of concentrating power and undermining institutions. And Ruth was, as an independent lawyer, presenting cases to the Salvadoran Supreme Court and doing all types of things to try and counter that democratic backsliding. And as democracy sort of backslid off of a cliff in El Salvador, Ruth took on very personally the task of defending it. And you would be surprised, as democracy comes under attack, there are very few champions who emerge to defend it. And so I think Ruth, in sort of a broader context where people are concerned about democratic backsliding around the world, becomes a symbol of resistance and courage, and someone who can speak to how we all should respond when freedoms are threatened.
Luis?
Well, I think Noah has very clearly expressed it. But yeah, I mean, for instance, it's important for us as family, for Ruth, to have a fair and public trial. That's like the fundamental. And then I think the U.S. policymakers should understand that we are right now living in a not in a democracy anymore, and that they should be doing anything that they think they can do to reestablish this regime, democracy, to the way that we Salvadorans can be able to exercise our rights without the fear of thinking we are going to be in jail because of it.
And so nearly a year later, the anniversary is Monday. What keeps you going to keep pushing forward in such a difficult situation?
I mean, first of all, we are sure that Ruth is innocent. We are sure, and we know that everything that is going on in her case is because they wanted to keep her voice silent, right? And as Noah said, she was one of the few, I think he said, champions that were trying to She was one of the few champions that were trying to impede the dictatorship to establish, Salvador. But it wasn't possible. But that's why we're keeping here our forces to try to bring her free, because
Mhm.
I think this is what justice must do. She's innocent. She has to be free. And I think if she is able to have a fair and public trial, she will demonstrate her innocence.
Before we close out, if there's just anything that you wanted to say more specifically about Ruth, WOLA, we did a podcast with her just about 2 months before she was arrested, talking about her work. And I remember very specifically doing that interview, just how humble she was during the interview. And also I worked at Cristosal in 2024, and she was always, a great person to work with, someone that really was very committed to the work. And I think it would be useful for people to understand a little bit more about her and the work that she was doing. If you have any kind of final closing words about that.
Well, I think Ruth, I used to say she's like my most famous friend. Like, she was recognized by the BBC as like one of the most, like, top 100 women, most influential women in the world. And she did things that made headlines and, got lots of likes on social media. It's interesting that her arrest was seen by over 100 million. The news of it was seen by over 100 million accounts worldwide, individual accounts. And she got that, she had that visibility, she had that credibility. But sometimes I think the most important work that Ruth did were, like 1,000 silent acts of solidarity and accompaniment, of her students. She taught at the university, her fellow colleagues in the legal community. Whatever anybody would ask of her, she would be willing to do it. She did hundreds of dialogues in communities and at churches on weekends about democracy and transparency. And that's why people feel so deeply the injustice against her. And because she was someone who was always generous, someone who was always willing to respond to people's needs and be with people who suffered abuses.
Well, I could say Ruth is a compassionate and humble woman who has always been trying to help those affected by injustice. And we need more of that in El Salvador. We need more of that in around the world. And that's why I think it's important for people to support us, to speak up for her.
When Ruth was arrested, there was a video that went viral, at least maybe in WOLA circles, of her at the moment of her saying, have this decency, this will also pass. And so can you speak to that a bit? What is being done? How are civil society organizations and other people like Ruth fighting so that this moment in El Salvador will eventually pass?
Well, Luis, I don't know if you wanna try that one, but I think I'll give one attempt to answer that. And I think that we've described an environment of fear. We've described a propaganda machine that tries to impose a story about the country, but there is an underlying truth that maybe is more silent. Every day there are more of us who are concerned about innocent people being put in prison, the loss of rights of people, the inability to be heard by the government when you have needs, when the decisions they make affect the rights and well-being of you and your family. And so I think that that's something that's unstoppable. When we see that over time, that when their lives and freedoms depend on it, resistance is the only option. And that gives us hope. There are brave people in El Salvador, and there are more and more people who agree with them. And so we have to support them. We have to be by their side as they take risks. But no regime of repression has ever been able to stop people from dreaming of having greater freedom, more democracy, better world.
Yeah, well, I think, as Noah says, people are realizing what's going on here more and more. And that's a good thing, because anything lasts forever. So here, people, I think more people are hoping that at some point, everything of this will end. This awful nightmare will end for us. And it's good to hear and to see how organizations are starting to support this fight of the narrative of the government, so that they can see what is really going on here. So it's good. I think it's good.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to you both for the work that you're doing, and thank you for joining us on the podcast today.